Thanks for hanging out with me today. Pretty excited about this topic. This is something we think about a lot, and no doubt many of you out there think about this on a day-to-day basis as well. We're going to cover a couple broad topic areas: conceptualizing engagement, how we should think about engagement, what it is, how might we design for engagement, what kinds of things influence engagement positively or negatively, how we measure engagement, particularly looking at both objective and subjective measures, and some new measures that have been developed for thinking about how to measure engagement. And if we have some time, questions permitting, and if we don't have some time, you can definitely feel free to hit me up, and I'd be happy to answer those at a later date. So let's dive into it, shall we? It has been said that there are 3 different kinds of users of digital behavior change interventions. There are those folks who come in once and never come in again. There are those that come in and use the intervention for a short time before fading off. And then there are those that come in and engage with your intervention in quite unpredictable patterns. And this is something that we need to contend with in order to design for patterns of engagement that we want, we think are acceptable, and what we believe will be aimed at reaching the target outcomes that we're hoping to achieve with any of the interventions that we put out into the world. When we think about where we are now with engagement and digital interventions, there's some good news. Theories of change are increasingly being used to develop and test those interventions. This was not quite so prevalent even, say, 3 to 5 years ago. Much more common now, and this is a good thing. Research and insights into how to foster engagement is really just now starting to gain momentum. We've looked at engagement from, say, the late 90s, early 2000s, from human-computer interaction, but in terms of its pure application into digital interventions, that's really just starting to gain steam over the last couple of years. And we know that applying theory and evidence to digital behavior change interventions can produce successful outcomes. There's a lot of examples and rigorously trialed digital interventions that are showing positive outcomes. So we know that this is a possibility. However, many interventions suffer from low use of features, very few logins, poor retention rates, and I'm sure that's why folks are here today. There's also different ideas about what engagement is, both within and between different fields of study, from psychology, from one flavor of engagement, behavioral science has another, human-computer interaction has yet another. And when we look at this, we can see there's all different kinds of terms that are tossed around that are either synonymous with engagement or seem to have something to do with it. Flow, presence, enjoyment, frequency, duration, posts. We can see these kinds of different terms that are either measures, they're goals, they're objectives. They're tossed around every day in different discussions on engagement. And if you noticed in those terms, you can get a hint at these 2 broad conceptual domains for how we might want to think about engagement. One is experiential, and one is behavioral. When we think about engagement as a subjective experience, we can think about that as a cognitive, emotional, and motivational state, and you saw some of those terms earlier. That state of engagement emerges during momentary interactions with interventions, or also, importantly, with offline target behavior. So while we're focused today on the technology side and interacting with technology to achieve outcomes, we want to make sure that we're very clear and also thinking about the real world or the offline target behaviors that our interventions are aimed at changing, right? These are what get us to those outcomes. So we need to think about both digital behaviors or digital actions, as I'll call them, and target behaviors in the real world. And the subjective experience side of engagement is often experienced as focused attention, interest, enjoyment, positive emotion, or loss of time when interacting with a product. And we see that most commonly with things like games or immersive environments, VR, AR, these kinds of things. When we think about engagement as behavior, right, very common in analytics, it describes both the extent of intervention usage and, again, the execution of target behaviors over time. This is sometimes referred to as the dose that's obtained by individuals, or also common to hear it described as adherence to an intervention. Are people doing the things we would like them to do in order to reap the benefits? And in interaction literature, there's longer periods of engagement. We can, think about as being described as stickiness, right? Getting people into an application and using it, as well as endurability, which is just another nice term to think about usage over time, right? So when we think about this, we've got subdimensions of engagement, these kinds of usage categories. When we think about usage, when we think about engagement as behavior, we can think about it in terms of its frequency, right? How often is the intervention used, or how often is a target behavior performed? We can think about its amount, right? And that's the total length of the intervention session or behavioral performance. So thinking about one session from launching an application to disengaging from that application, or total time across sessions as well. Duration we can think of in terms of engagement over a period of time, days, weeks, months of use, from initial download and onboarding through either disengagements because all goals are met, or something more nefarious has happened along the route. We can also think about depth of engagement, which would be the variety of content used. So if we think about content in its broadest terms, things like text, like videos, like activities, like self-tracking, all the different ingredients and pieces, components that make up a digital intervention. And also, finally, intensity, right? How much effort is expended? And this is usually associated more with those real-world behaviors than with digital behaviors. And these are important. Thinking about engagement as behavior in these terms will then allow us to think about how we might measure those, what we can look at, and in particular, how much engagement might be enough for reaching the goals that we're hoping people achieve. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So we have a definition of engagement that spans both these experiential and these behavioral domains. So to come to a complete definition, a really nice one from researchers over at University College London, Olga Persky and Blanford and co., have a two-part definition that says engagement can be defined as the extent, amount, frequency, duration, and depth to which a person uses an intervention or performs a target behavior, and that subjective experience captured by attention, interest, and affect, so positive emotion there as well. In these dimensions is a reciprocal interaction, right? The behavioral dimensions are underpinned by the subjective experience, what it actually feels like to be engaged, and that's a dynamic process that varies within individuals, across individuals, within a session, and across sessions over time. And this is an important thing to wrap our heads around as well, right? The idea of engagement being trait-based, being very variable between and across people and even within people as well. And so when we think about why we care about this, why this is important, to state the obvious, digital interventions need to be used to be effective, right? No usage, no outcomes, or no outcomes attributed to the intervention itself in any event. And additionally, those target behaviors need to be performed in the real world in order for those outcomes to occur. And we can see this as a causal chain, right? So when we think about on the left, engagement of the intervention exposes the active ingredients of the intervention. Those are all the components that you've worked to design to include that are aimed at changing offline behaviors, right? So those active ingredients, the behavior change techniques, facilitate that engagement with offline behaviors, and that leads to outcome effects. I'm being single-fingered. Hold on.
We got a question, and I thought it's important to cover it now, but could you repeat what DBSI stands for?
Oh, sorry about that. DBCI, Digital Behavior Change Intervention. It's a real mouthful to keep saying that, so DBCI, or I may say just intervention, but I mean digital. You're welcome. All right, so if we think about this causal chain and these category types, we can look at that a little in a little bit more detail. So for example, if we think about weight loss applications, right, if we've got a goal and our goal is to help people lose weight for whatever reason that might be, we can think about the digital interaction that might be logging food, right? There could be a food logging library where we put in what we eat and count our calories and macronutrients. That exposes people to a few different behavior change techniques, which is how we describe those active ingredients, right? We can imagine that having goal setting, to set a goal of 1,200 calories. We can monitor ourselves and see how we're doing with each juicy morsel that we shove in our faces, and we can get feedback that let us know, are we aiming, towards, under that goal, so that we can do the things we need to do to consume less calories in a day, ultimately building up and hopefully leading to weight loss, at least in that chain. And to drive it home, we can also think about this application might have a meal planning feature as well, where I can pick recipes and I can stack things together, so it's very easy to look at my weight for my week and save time. Those active ingredients might be instruction, right? They might teach me how to cook certain things or teach me about what kinds of foods go together or ingredients. And then it might allow me to plan my week a little bit better, so some action planning. That will facilitate eating less, losing weight, and I got one more in here. So again, we could think about it on the other side. Maybe there's a virtual gym in our application, a nice sort of Peloton style virtual gym or whatever you might be into. I decide to work out 3 times per week through the digital gym, and again, I'm exposed to some planning, I'm exposed to instruction, and also I'm exposed to social support, right? We think about the group or the social engagement, which will facilitate further engagement to increase my physical activity, resulting in weight loss.
Can I ask you a question?
Another question.
Yes. Do you see that the causal change is being directly linked to the user journey map?
It can. We'll talk a little bit about in the design section about designing with intent and working to stack these different kinds of causal chains together within a matrix. You could make it pretty and more like a journey map as well, but certainly building that out in some kind of matrix as well. So then the ultimate question is often how much engagement is enough, right? We're always being asked such things. And it's really, really common to think about the underlying assumption that more or greater usage is optimal, right? But but that's not always true. We've been in a habit, all of us in the industry, of building these digital hamster wheels where it's one activity after another activity after another activity. It's log in all day, every day, 24/7. This is not ideal, and it's not ideal for a number of reasons. One, the burden and burnout is great, obviously leading to drop-off and disengagement. Again, that common cliff that we see. But also the relationship between usage and health is complex, right? What one person may need more intervention time than another to reach the same kinds of goals. And usually the strategy is not continuous forever engagement, right? So we now have a consensus in the behavioral science field looking at digital interactions to say we really need to get better about understanding and promoting an effective level of engagement with digital interventions, really trying to understand what is effective versus what is just engagement for engagement's sake. And we think about that construct as effective engagement. Fancy that. Simply as a definition, it's sufficient engagement with an intervention to achieve the desired outcomes, right? And this is at the intervention level, really. We want to understand for each and every one of the interventions that we're responsible for, what is that appropriate level of engagement for different people, for groups, for individuals, ideally, if we can get down to the individual level, but thinking about it in terms of the specific intervention rather than a more broad, generalizable amount across all kinds of interventions, or all weight loss, or all physical activity, or all glucose monitoring interventions, right? We really want to think about the particular intervention, although we can learn from similar interventions from research, but we want to get down to our specific level as well. Right, and those outcomes, again, are the behavioral outcomes, execution of those target behaviors, clinical outcomes, financial, quality of life, and so on. So if we think about sufficient engagement with that intervention, again, it could vary for different groups, behaviors, or settings, and where possible, analyses of usage should seek to identify those thresholds for effective engagement. And that's part of the work we'll talk about doing. If we think about what this might look like in terms of a slightly abstract diagram, we can think about a journey, I guess you have one here, from onboarding, initiation, or behavioral activation, taking those first steps, to maintenance of behavior, right? And on the top, we've got the intervention, the digital intervention, and we've got our target behaviors over time. And we can see a couple things with this, fictitious pattern. We can think about that onboarding. Maybe I create a profile, maybe I take an assessment, maybe I learn about what the intervention does or can do for me, set my expectations, explore. We've got a bit of a surface level engagement with the intervention, right? There's no change happening. There's nothing in the real world happening yet, but we do have that surface level engagement. I'm engaging with the intervention, not necessarily with those behaviors. We want to move into that next stage where we've got effective engagement, and it's mediated by the digital tool. I use the tool. It gives me the ingredients that I need in order to execute those behaviors in the real world. Then we can look here up in this corner, and we can notice that while the real-world behaviors, the target behaviors, seem to be going really well, we're no longer using the digital tool. So if it's still effective, change is happening, but we're no longer using the intervention. And this is another concept that sort of tilts engagement on its head, right? is it okay when people disappear? Number one. Number two, if they disappear, if they stop using our intervention, does that mean they have failed? Or perhaps it means that they've made the changes, they've gotten what they need, and they no longer need the intervention anymore. It's really important to be able to reach out to these kinds of individuals in part of your research to see what's going on, not only with people who still use, but people who have disengaged for whatever reason, to see if they've made the successful outcomes that we're all hoping. And they may re-engage at some point, right? They may lapse, they may have a difficulty, and they may come back or maybe set a new goal further down the road. So that's a really nice way to think about or conceptualize engagement, right? Enough usage with an intervention to get the outcomes that we're looking for. When we think about how to do that, we want to think about a couple key themes. We want to think about designing with intent, right? Intentionally designing an intervention that uses, well, the best of behavior change design. So thinking about what outcomes do we wish to see as a result, right? What can we expect? What do we hope for? How will we measure them? What behaviors will result in those outcomes? What do we want people to do? What underpins those behaviors that might need to shift? Is it motivation? Is it knowledge? Is it skills training, beliefs, attitudes, social support? And then to change those things, what kinds of functions and techniques do we need to include? Do we need to educate? Do we need to motivate? Do we need to provide skill support, goal setting, these kinds of things? And we also want to think about what kinds of engagement patterns we're trying to foster and why. Not only what kind of pattern, but why. Really have a rationale for the kinds of engagement or the amount of usage we're looking for, and also think about what kinds of strategies or techniques are likely to have an effect. We also want to test with intent. We really want to look at both what people are actually doing within an intervention and compare that to our assumptions and our intended use. And we want to think about between those two things, we also want to try to understand, is there a dose-response effect? How do the outcomes, or people that are successful, how does that correlate with their levels of engagement? And on the other side of it, for people who haven't quite made outcomes yet, are there patterns that you can detect with what they're interacting with as well as how much they're interacting with? So in order to do this, we need to have 4 things. We need to have the ability to measure desired outcomes in individuals. We can think about that from a baseline, from an end of intervention, at a point in time, some way to measure outcomes, right? Clearly measure those outcomes. The ability to measure the usage in individuals, so finding those analytics and how people are using and engaging with the application. We want to have a rendering of intended use, right? And that just means we need to have some kind of prototype or functioning code in order to be able to track usage. And we want to have either an empirical, theoretical, or rational justification for intended use, right? If we build usage from theory, maybe we're in a better spot than guessing. And being able to provide this rationale helps with thinking through what we're going to design, how to get buy-in when we're collaborating with other folks, either internal teams or external stakeholders as well. And we see a few different kinds of patterns or implementations when we think about this intended use. And I think we all see these when we talk about, well, how should people be using it? How much is enough? What should we do? We typically see one category of intended use we call time bandits, right? that assumption simply that the more use, the better, right? And we talked about why that's not great, but it's also not concrete enough. It becomes really hard to measure simply more. We want to get a bit more specific than that. And if we do, we might call that a stab in the dark, right? We want people to log in at least once a week for 3 subsequent weeks, or 100 times a week, whatever that might be, right? And again, when we hear these kinds of phrases, there's typically no rationalization for why that frequency is desired, right? We just feel it. We're just intuitive. And maybe our intuitions have led us astray. And ideally, we're thinking about this from an evidence base, right? Either from primary or secondary research. We know that people benefit the most when they complete all the modules in the default order. So here would be, our own research that says doing modules 1 through 5 in its order versus 2, 3, 4, 1, and 5 is suboptimal, right? So we've got a grounded rationale from our own research that says how we should think about structuring, sequencing the things people will consume and the things people will do in the intervention we design. So where do we start? So if we're modifying an existing intervention, so we've got an intervention and we're hoping to maybe improve outcomes, improve engagement, we might want to perform an audit. If we're developing a new intervention, we probably want to at least start with following the evidence-based intervention design process. For us here, we use a combination of behavior change wheel developed at UCL and intervention mapping, of course, with a good dose of human-centered design mixed in there as well. So when we think about our goals in linking outcomes to engagement, right, the definition of effective engagement, we want to try to understand what the proposed logic in an intervention is and what are the active ingredients for how it works, right? What are the things people are reading, doing that we believe are going to lead to those outcomes, right? To do that, again, we want to make sure we've established those outcome measures and indicators, including offline behaviors if we haven't yet, and we need some kind of method to track those as well. So making sure we have that set up. From there, we really want to look at what features, functions, content are currently in your intervention tasked with affecting those outcomes, right? What different kinds of things are in your intervention that you believe lead directly to outcomes, are beneficial, right? We also can think about for those different features, whether that's a tracker, whether that's an article that I read, whether that's a community or a blog post, what's the purpose? What's the function of that element? Is it to motivate? Is it to build knowledge? Is it to build skill? And are these the constructs that need to change for behavior to occur? And again, the same with techniques as well, self-monitoring, goal setting, feedback. From there, we want to think about what patterns of engagement, how much digital tracking, how many articles, how many modules, how many posts, if I believe posts leads to outcomes in the community, should we be aiming our audience for? And we can put these into matrices. So if we look here, if we think about that chain, right, outcomes on the back, we're going to change HbA1c, BMI, BP. These could be a bit more specific with targets or ranges, 7% or something. We want to think about what those target behaviors are that will lead to those outcomes: eating, physical activity, meds, smoking, drinking, appointments. We want to think about what kinds of determinants might need to change for those behaviors. Do I know about carbs and carb intake? Do I have the motivation to quit smoking? Do I believe that increased physical activity is going to help lower my lipids, for example? And then we can look over at the intervention itself and think about all the different kinds of content. 16 educational modules, what's inside those modules, information, instruction. We can look at different trackers or visualizations that's there, and how much engagement is in each one of these. So 20 minutes completed in 5-minute chunks per day. That's one module per week. That's about 16 weeks. That's if we believe we go all in. If we think about trackers, using those over 16 weeks, again, we can think about email campaigns, how many emails, how many of those we need to absorb. We can think about community support as well down at the bottom. We can see there that we're alluding to research that's been performed that shows that 5 minutes per week in the community, whether that's active or passive, has been associated with better outcomes than those who do not. And we can also end this by framing both the intervention context, where is it used, and the different theories we might have used or applied to design the intervention. So when we think about changing behavior through prompts, we can think about control theory, setting a goal, setting an action plan, giving feedback. We can think about supporting autonomy, competence from self-determination theory. We can think about helping people regulate their behaviors. So we want to be able to jot down outcomes, behaviors, the factors that need to, the determinants that need to move for behaviors to happen, the content that we have, and the expected engagement patterns and usage patterns. Sometimes it's not possible to determine what that intended use is. It's not an easy thing to do. And also, it might not be possible to provide justification. We might just not have the body of knowledge or the research behind it. And that's okay. In these kinds of cases, or also with existing interventions, we might want to look at actual usage and outcomes together to try to find and link those associations. So when we think about usage, and we kick it back to where we started around those behavioral constructs of usage, we can get a little bit more specific when we look at analytics within a digital intervention. Specifically, there's many different kinds of analytics and metrics that we can look at. A few that we've got structured according to that definition that we think are useful or predictive of good engagement. We can think about the number of logins that people do. And those could be per day, those could be per week, over time, in total. We can think about the frequency of interaction, how many times per day, right? Desired as and existing. How many days are people using that intervention over time? And how much time is spent within the application itself? Again, we can look at different slices or chunks, whether those are day or week or what have you. We also want to look at the content consumed or interacted with, using features here broadly, but that could, again, be a tool. It could be something that you read, something that you use or consume. So the number of features, how many things am I using, or the number of pages as well, right, to think about the breadth. And if we've got a very structured intervention, which we'll talk about, we can also think about it in terms of modules, right? Am I completing modules? We see this very common in interventions that have a lot of knowledge gaps to fill or skills development. If we think about diabetes management, for example, there's a lot of diabetes education that needs to go on, and this might be done in a module kind of way. And then very often a component to much of the digital interventions are tracking or self-reporting some kind of metrics, whether those are behaviors, whether those are physiological measures, or whether that's what I ate today. So we can look at the amount of things tracked. And of course, getting down to the level of the specific content that people are using. What are they using? What are they not using, right? And what does that look like in terms of how it relates to outcomes? So when we look at our population, we can look at individuals that have hit the thresholds for change, hit our targets that we're looking to achieve, and we can backtrack and look at the extent of their usage along those metrics on the left, as well as the exposure, what specific content, right? So for those who were successful, how much did they engage, to what extent did they engage, and what specific things did they engage with? And we can also compare that to folks that are not yet successful and look at those same kinds of patterns, right? And when we do this, we can see a lot of surprising things. For example, we worked with the Truth Initiative designing, or redesigning, I should say, a digital smoking cessation intervention, mobile and desktop intervention. And the crux of it is it has a very, very person-centered, staged chunks of content and activities or actions for an individual to take, right? Whether I'm still thinking about quitting, whether I'm preparing, whether I recently quit and I'm relapsing or I'm trying to stay quit, there is tools, there is content that is all evidence-based and structured down to the individual level. And there's also a community where people can interact and provide emotional social support as well. What was found in the research that I think is pretty fascinating, and other folks have reported these same kind of effects called one-hit wonders, where people come in, they register, they use the application once, and they never come back, right? In research, that's almost always counted as a fail, right, with intention to treat. We didn't do our job. And I think the same in commercial or product world as well. We consider that, that person must have dropped off and failed. But when you reach out and you find these people, as Truth did, a good proportion of those individuals that said they never came back or didn't come back did so because they successfully quit smoking, right? They also reported that not only did I quit, but I found what I was looking for within your intervention. That gave me what I need to go out and make the changes in the real world. So we have some sort of dose here, some sort of effective engagement from one interaction. Not at all what you would typically expect. What was also found in this study was that when we look at all the different kinds of evidence-based content that's here and tools for people to use, the strongest association for people that successfully quit is actually engaging with the community, right, versus all of the other content and tools. They grouped those individuals by non-users, folks that didn't use community at all, no posts, no page views. They did it by passive viewers, right, users, people who read or lurked but didn't really post, and then active users as well that both posted and read other people's content. So what you might think about as highly engaged, at least highly engaged in the community. And we could see those abstinence rates were most effective for active users, right? 20%. It's almost double passive users as well. So engaging and doing so in a highly active manner doubled those abstinence rates and looking at compared to non-users down at 7.7%. And you can think about that to say, well, is there a reverse causality there? And that can be an interesting question as well. Are the folks that are successful engaging more because they're successful, or are the people that are engaging more having those successes? And sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge to nestle out, but a great question to investigate. So again, that said, we might not have expected that with all the effort in the tools and in the intervention design that it would be the social support, the emotional support, the community that had the biggest effect on outcomes. So those kinds of tests can really help you see what's happening with your intervention and how people are engaging and how engagement might be linked to outcomes. So when we think about designing for engagement, we can think about a few different variables that are worth talking about. The structure of your intervention, is it sequential and step-by-step, or is it open? We can think about active versus passive content. We can look at engagement across sessions or over time, so coming back for more than one use. And we can think about what we call here session loops. So what does a session look like from the moment I come into your intervention to the moment I disengage and then come back over time? When we think about that structure, and these are decisions that we can make when we design interventions, hopefully we're making these decisions with intent. But are we building an intervention that is sequenced in modules or lessons that people complete in a particular order? Is it very structured? Is it open, or what we call free range, right, which are different elements or tools or content that people can use at their own convenience? Maybe it's a personal health record with a diary, some educational material, and a way to message a clinician. Really common and one that we like a lot now too is thinking about hybrid and hybrid interventions, which might have a fixed core, so you might have some structural sequenced engagement and learning, as well as open or free range tools, content that people can use as they need it. And we've been thinking about this one a lot lately too. It seems to be the best of both worlds. We can use that open content to allow people to explore, learn a bit more about the intervention, find exactly what they're looking for, hopefully, and then when they've interacted with a few things, we can prompt them, hopefully in a data-driven way, to engage with a more structured intervention that fits their needs, right? People are going to have different needs. Some folks are going to like open-ended, some folks are going to like structure, but using this hybrid approach gives us the best of both worlds. And another kind of intervention structure that's gaining some traction is what we call JEDIs, or just-in-time adaptive interventions, which are great because they're a low burden on the user, and JEDIs, if you do some research there, it's all about contextually triggering advice, messages, strategies for individuals based on what we know or learn about a user or their environmental context. So for example, using something like geocaching to say, help someone drink less or smoke less. That says like, hey, we know on your way home you're going to walk past the pub. We may want to intervene when you get into a certain zone before you get there to send you a prompt to say, turn left instead of going straight, or something probably more effective than that. 10 minutes. Okay. Right. So we can also think about active and passive content and the effects that we might have there. Again, passive, things we read, watch, listen, look at, and active, really thinking about the activities that require input, whether those are exercises, fill in the blanks, drag and drop kind of things, things for people to reflect on, or active tracking, or any other kinds of interactive engagement. And thinking about the balance that we have here, because again, when you look more broadly, different people have preferences and or more receptive to one kind of content over the other, and both might provoke change. You could look at folks, again, that are highly engaged with very interactive content and folks that are readers or lurkers, and they may also successfully make changes as well. There may be a differential between the two, but having that content for both. But also to say, to think about, again, remind yourself that some activity is required, right? Again, if our goal is to facilitate offline behavior, probably some kind of activity, whether that's behavior or physiological data, if we want to measure outcomes, is needed there too. Active tracking is great, but we don't quite have the technology to do that yet. I'm going to go a little faster. We can put these into matrices as well. I think this one's from a workshop, but really thinking about the life cycle or the journey from adoption through maintenance and re-engagement, what content elements that you have, the usage that you expect, what barriers that you address, along with real-world behaviors as well, what those target behaviors are, and the usage there too. All right. Another thing that's nice to think about in terms of getting our heads around engagement during a day is a model that was developed by Heather O'Brien, a researcher, I think, at Yahoo at some point, thinking about these different stages of interaction within a session and the close of a session. We find, we've adapted it a bit, but we found it to be really interesting for thinking about what to measure, what to research, and how to design these different loops of engagement. So if we think about the point of engagement, when someone first, if we have an app, for example, when someone first launches your app, what were they doing right before that app, right, that launch? What caused them to open the application at that moment in time? They might have had an internal motivation or a goal that they wanted to fulfill with the app. They might have been responding to something in their environment. Maybe they were just had a really high stressful meeting and wanted to de-stress with some meditation, or maybe they received a prompt or an alert or a push notification to open the app and we're in. We can think about the session again and measure that in terms of the usage metrics we talked about. And this is the time a person has your application open and is engaging with that application. At some point, they're going to close and disengage from the intervention, right? They could do that for a variety of reasons as well. They achieved a goal, they got what they needed, they've made a new goal, they're off to something else, maybe in a different app competition, or maybe it's pizza across the room. They might be responding to that pizza or an environmental event, or again, they could get a prompt from a different kind of application that sent them off into a Facebook posting instead. At some point, we think about the strategies for how to get people back into the application. We want to give them external alerts, prompts, emails, SMS, etc., in order to drive them back in. So thinking about this holistically, from that point of engagement through what happens to the session, through what mechanisms get people to disengage, and then what can we do, what kind of strategies can we implement in order to pull people back into the application, right? Messages, push notifications, and so forth. One more note about disengagement that we've been thinking a lot about recently is this. Disengagement or going away is not something to be afraid of. It's a natural part of the cycle of interaction. And is that an opportunity for us to design with intent, right? So to get people off of the hamster wheel with more and more and more, can we be a bit more tactful about how much engagement we're looking for over the course of a day, over the course of a week, during a session? You could notice some new tweaks, I think, in Instagram. If those of you who don't have like 1 billion people that you're following, you can start to see, instead of the endless scroll, they give you a nice little prompt now that says, you've seen it, that's all for now. You've seen all the content. You're all caught up, I think is the phrase they use. So they're designing disengagement with intent, right? That gives an individual a stopping point, a nice natural stopping point to leave the application. Then it's our job, hopefully we've provided value to the individual where we can rely on strategies to re-engage, or if the user has built a habit or, again, has found that value intrinsic, they will happily thumb that app icon on their phone at some point in the future. So really big opportunity for thinking about how to design the moment, the point of disengagement. Something we're really excited about doing a lot and a lot more this year. And I yapped like way too long. We've got 3 minutes left. This is here. You will get the deck. I wasn't going to deep dive into all of these anyway. I wanted to create some kind of rubric at common strategies. We were starting to think about what are the most common strategies for engagement, and what does the evidence, whether that's research or whether that's our experience, say regarding their effectiveness. I think everyone knows what these things are. So apply at will, and I think I need to jump ahead and call this a day. So,
but if we have a couple of minutes for questions. So we have a couple of quick questions here. At the end, somebody asked, if we, when creating DBCIs, how often do you pull from the field of behavioral economics and our emerging understanding of human behavior, like Dan Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, et cetera?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about applying a theoretical base to the interventions that we design, sometimes that theoretical base is explicitly behavioral economics. So there are opportunities where that might be the best fit, or maybe that's the proclivity that a client might have. So in those kinds of cases, we go all in, right? We'll think about heuristics and biases and principles, and we'll use those to guide the intervention. It may not be our number one go-to. We think about, again, behavior change techniques. If you look up behavior change technique taxonomy, V1, there's a list of 93 behavior change techniques. That tends to be our go-to over behavioral economics phenomena, but we do use that when and where it's appropriate as well.
One final question is that how much pre-intervention and post-intervention market research do you tend to do with samples of a target audience?
Yeah. When we can, we try to do our own formative research in every project. That can consist of a few key activities. That is getting direct with target audiences that will benefit from the intervention that we're about to design or adapt. That is definitely also looking at the existing body of knowledge or the published research around a particular health condition, financial phenomena, population as well, right? So we want to look at what's been done before us, what's been found to work and not work, so that we can apply that with the best of intentions as well. And in some cases too, we may go up the chain further to really large sample sizes and think about doing segmentation and segmentation analysis as well, particularly if we've got the hunch that we are going to be doing machine learning or very detailed, tailored interventions, right? We want to tailor the content and the interaction to different individuals and segments.
Can I ask one quick last question?
Yeah, of course. I'm here.
So Jean asked, on the last slide, why do incentives trend negatively?
Oh, man, that's a great question. Yeah, so talk to me with some beer over this, too. However, incentives, right, is so common as a strategy. What we see in the literature and what we've seen in the literature for 40 years is when we think about behavior, and we think about behavior in terms of being driven by motivation, incentives can work as an extrinsic motivator, which is pretty good for motivating in the short term, but much of health, much of financial goals, much of the kind of interventions that we work on, we're looking for long-term or sustained change or behaviors to persist over time. Incentives can get people off the ground and running. Incentives can get people to sort of fake their way through it, like put in quantity of behavior but not quality. The problem is that it can damage or undermine good quality motivation over time, making those behaviors less desirable and less sticky and sustained. So it can actually have a damaging effect over time. Really popular, really common, but it is fraught with challenges.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dustin. I hope you guys found that incredibly interesting. I did. I learned a lot. Feel free to reach out to us. Here at MadPow and the Center for Health Experience Design, there's a lot we can help you to achieve your design and innovation goals. So we do offer things like research and strategy, user experience design, service design, intervention design and evaluation, and design and innovation challenges. Feel free to email us with any questions. Thank you so much.
Bye.